Now, while Donald Trump is in the United Kingdom meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the King of England, the highest-ranking U.S. official on American soil is Vice President JD Vance. The VP visited Michigan yesterday, making a stop at a metal stamping plant in Howell. Vance toured the facility before delivering a speech to a room full of largely conservative supporters. The visit came 1 week after conservative activist Charlie Kirk was murdered by a gunman in Utah. However, the White House says the main goal of the visit was to talk up President Trump's economy. WDET journalist Alex McLennan was in Howell for J.D. Vance's visit, and he joins the Metro now in the studio. Alex, good morning. Thank you for coming on in.
Good morning, Dave.
All right, so first things first, what did J.D. Vance say at a stop in Howell?
Well, he said a few things, and there was a slate of other conservative speakers that went before him. But Vance was, of course, the keynote speaker at this stamping plant in Howell. He toured the facility. He spoke for about 20 minutes, kept it pretty to the point. Key issues he touched on were things like Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill Act. He was telling the room of conservative supporters why he thinks that budget plan works for them. He touched a bit on Charlie Kirk, obviously. He touched on U.S. forces sinking suspected drug boats off the coast of Venezuela. He did joke about maybe not fishing over there. And on National Guard deployments, he also spoke. And it's probably worth noting that J.D. Vance has been making a number of talking stops like this one in Howell in recent weeks. He's done similar engagements in places like Georgia and Wisconsin. And that's because, we're about a year out from midterms at this point. Historically, the party that wins the presidential election has a harder time in midterms holding seats in Congress. So they're kind of getting ahead of that. Pretty easy to imagine that's why Republicans are putting Vance out there in these kind of swing states, speaking at events like this to rally support among their base.
Mm-hmm. So, Alex, Vance hit on a couple of different major categories, and yes. I'm curious about in the room, kind of give us a feel for the atmosphere of that place. I mean, was there any topics that really riled people up that got a particular reaction?
Well, Charlie Kirk topics are rallying calls right now for Republicans. There was a section of students in the room from the Michigan State chapter of Turning Point USA who the speakers, point to a few times. One of them spoke at a point. But in general, it was pretty much all the above. Get strong support from the base when a critical leader of the base is talking to them. These events are kind of predictable like that. But yeah, I would say that the Charlie Kirk thing, people got riled up about the idea of National Guard deployments in Detroit. Of course, the people there were more from the northern suburbs than from Detroit. Think what you want of that. But that was also something that got a pretty big cheer from the crowd.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. So the headlines coming out of this speech, a lot of them were about what he said about National Guard deployments. We've seen them across the U.S. in various cities. What did Vance say about National Guard deployments here?
Well, Vance was, of course, supportive of Trump's move to deploy National Guard in U.S. cities. The vice president used wording that, largely echoed Donald Trump's rhetoric about the move, saying that it's, quote, about taking back American streets. Of course, a couple weeks ago, Trump deployed the National Guard in Washington, D.C., and now just a couple days ago in Memphis. And J.D. Vance had this to say about the idea of putting boots on the ground in Detroit.
My one message to Gretchen Whitmer is, look, the city of Detroit we know has got some serious crime problems, and we know that it's the people in Detroit who suffer the most when crime is allowed to run rampant all over city streets. Gretchen, we are happy to send the National Guard to Detroit, Michigan. All you got to do is ask.
Okay, so hearing some enthusiasm, like you mentioned before, people talking or cheering at Vance's comments. But, I mean, how much of that is playing to the crowd and just knowing, what he needs to say to get a reaction? How much of it might actually be serious and credible?
Well, that's the thing with that is, how much of it is playing to the crowd and how much of it is a serious threat. The reason we're talking about this, though, is because a lot of the things with the administration ultimately end up acting on have begun as these kind of tongue-in-cheek remarks at different media or rally events, like the comments that Vance made in Howell. Now, the Trump administration recently threatened to send the Guard to Chicago. That they kind of backed down on after a lot of kind of pushback from the governor there before they refocused to Memphis. And the thing to keep in mind with Michigan, and that's kind of, if you listen carefully to Vance's wording there, he talks about wanting Whitmer to ask for it. The other thing to remember, though, is that Whitmer and Trump have seemed to be on surprisingly good terms right now. They were not during Trump's first term in office. They seem to have been during this term. Whitmer has been to the White House a couple of times. They appeared together at Selfridge Air Base earlier in the year. They seem to have a pretty good rapport, which, if you're looking for a reason to maybe dampen the expectation of National Guard in Detroit, there might not be a whole lot of, reason for Trump to do that, considering he seems to be on good terms with people in the city right now. But again, the reason we're talking about it is because some of these tongue-in-cheek messages from the administration ultimately become actions. And the important thing to say when it comes to crime in Detroit is, of course, that for the last few years, crime has been coming down. Homicides are down. Carjackings are down. Detroit officials will bring that up pretty freely because it is, obviously a good thing, crime going down. And the other thing to probably say is that criticism of the about deploying the National Guard is that it can unnecessarily escalate tension, which can potentially lead to more crime. And the other kind of warning that critics of it say is the threat of it kind of normalizing the idea of troops in cities, which is probably something not to take for granted either. But was it a tongue-in-cheek message? Time will tell. The good news is that it does seem like relations between the White House and key political figures in Michigan right now are pretty good.
Well, yeah, I guess it remains to be seen because, of course, Detroit will have a new mayor before long. And Mayor Duggan right now has kind of notably had a at least amicable relationship with Donald Trump.
Well, they share a lot of donors. So.
Sure, they share donors, and I think Duggan has been a really, in many ways, effective liaison, it seems, with the White House, whether it was President Biden or President Trump. When there's a new mayor, we'll see how that relationship moves forward when he's out of office. So I guess that remains to be seen when it comes to National Guard deployments. If you're just joining us, I'm here with Alex McLennan, reporter for WDET. He was in Howell yesterday reporting on a press conference with Vice President JD Vance. We're also fundraising to support journalism like this. And Alex's reporting was featured on the national NPR broadcast. Support that kind of journalism. WDET.org. Make that gift. And while you're listening to the rest of this news report, tell us why you're supporting us, why you're supporting WDET journalism. WDET.org. Okay, so Alex, let's go back to this press conference. The reason the White House said J.D. Vance was here was to talk about economics and Trump's economic plan. What did the vice president have to say about that?
Well, it was supportive of the economic plan, of course, and specifically, he laid out for the crowd the parts of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill Act that he thinks are good for them.
We fought for no taxes on overtime and no taxes on tips because we want you to keep more of your hard-earned money. We fought for an increase to the child tax credit because we want to make it easier for young families to bring new life into this world and to raise that new life in security and prosperity and comfort. The Working Families Tax Cut is not just a big 1,000-page bill. It is an important part, maybe the most important part, to restarting the American dream in this country.
Now, critics of Trump's economic plan counter that any kind of gains made in those areas are kind of offset by cuts to things like health care that stands to raise costs for a lot of Americans. People have also been critical of Trump's spending plan for raising national debt by trillions of dollars. That's one of the things that when Republicans got into office, they said they were going to work to cut down. One person who's been outspoken against it is Michigan Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens, who is critical of the excuse me, I got my papers all mixed up. She was critical of the budget. She had a Zoom call yesterday, and she had this to say about the taxes in the budget plan.
While billionaires get a break, billionaires, everyday people are paying more. Michiganders are paying more. It is not acceptable.
Now, Stevens said that on a Zoom call, as I mentioned in that Zoom call, was her introducing a piece of legislation, her so-called No Tariffs on Groceries Act. That legislation would take aim at some of Trump's tariff policies, making it so that Congress would have to approve tariffs that impact groceries. The argument there is that while the White House has been placing kind of broad tariffs on countries to try to incentivize bringing things like manufacturing to the country, certain things kind of get lost in that. For example, when it comes to things like crops, you can't really grow a lot of bananas in America. It just doesn't, things like that don't really work. So Haley Stevens' idea is that her legislation would hypothetically helped to close that loophole by making Congress actually have to take a look at the tariffs and kind of write out those parts where food is included, food that, we can't relocate crops to the U.S. that aren't, good for the climate here. JD Vance stands by Trump's tariff policy, though, speaking in Howell. He told the crowd it helps create more jobs at places like the metal stamping plant he was at and encourages other countries to make new trade deals with the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to close this out with, we have to talk about Charlie Kirk's assassination. I'm sure it came up. What were people saying at this about Charlie Kirk? How did this come up?
Yeah, so it was one of the main talking points. Every speaker that stepped up brought it up in some way or another. There was a speaker there from the Michigan State chapter of Turning Point USA, as I mentioned. And the thing that Republicans keep hanging on with Charlie Kirk, and fairly so, is that he was fairly emblematic of everything that the party currently stands for, and that's why they're using him as kind of a rallying whistle to stick to the conservative cause, the things that he stood for like that. One of the interesting wordings that one of the speaker used was calling him a peacemaker, not a peacekeeper, which I thought was interesting wording. Things like that with subtle undertones I don't know about. Vance was pretty on the line when he was talking about how he stood for conversations and stuff. Of course, the criticisms that go the other way about that is to what degree. Something like one of Vance's college setups was really a setup for neutral debate. When it was, and that's why you keep hearing Republicans say how fundamental he was to attracting youth into the party. One of the things that Vance mentioned was that Kirk also played a role in helping Trump make some of his appointments. So it wasn't just that he was a political commentator. Because of the way that Republicans felt he rallied youth for Republicans specifically is why they're hanging on to that messaging with him. Obviously, there's counter arguments that go the other way on that in the way that debates were conducted. Like, you can say it's a debate, but when it's, there isn't middle ground being found and it is being so closely linked to a political party, how much of that is really open and honest debate, that is for individuals to decide. All right.
Alex McLennan from WDET reporter, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro today.
Thank you, Dave.